Thank you for joining us this morning. This will be our third Sunday, which we're not holding public services, but meeting together, as it were, online. And we will probably continue this until we understand that we've got the all clear to begin meeting again. We just want to try to look out for everyone's safety and get through this current health issue and situation best we can. So, today I'd like to read to you from Romans chapter 1 and beginning with verse 13. This is the Apostle Paul writing to the Christians that are at Rome. And by the way, he knows that they are Christians, but he hasn't met them. These are not his converts, so he's writing to people he does not know. And actually, this is not really what I want to talk about today, but on a side thought, greatly beneficial for us that he does not know them, because since he has not already met these Romans and preached to them, he is laying out his message in this letter to the Romans in greater detail than he does anywhere else in his writings. So we benefit from having an in-depth exploration of Paul's teaching and his doctrine in this letter to the Romans. It's well worth reading and studying. So here he's writing to Christians that he's not yet met, and he says in verse 13, "Now I would not have you ignorant, brethren, that oftentimes I purposed to come unto you, but was hindered up until now, that I might have some fruit among you also, even as among other Gentiles." Verse 14 he says, "I am a debtor, both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the unwise. So, as much as is in me is, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also." Now here he says, I want to come and visit you and I want to preach to you the gospel. Now sometimes we assume that the gospel is just a message that is intended for unbelievers to encourage them to be converted and to become Christians. But here Paul's not writing to unbelievers, he's writing to Christians. And he says to them, I want to come and preach to you the gospel. So if Paul felt that these Christians in Rome have need of hearing the gospel, I would say that we Christians here in our day also have need of hearing the gospel as well. The gospel is not just a message designed for unbelievers to say you need to get saved. In fact, that's not what the message is at all. It's a message not about you need to do anything, but it's a message, as we will see, about something that Christ has already done. And by the way, I should add that the word gospel literally means good news. So what I like to say is, if it's not good news, it's not the gospel. Now, let's go on reading here. He says in verse 15, I am ready to preach to you the gospel. And verse 16, he adds, for I, that is Paul, he says, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. Now that last part, I guess I should address that first. When he says to the Jew first and also to the Greek, he just means that the nation of Israel were first in line because they had a covenant with God already. And so when Jesus came into the world, to begin with, in his earthly ministry, he went exclusively to the nation of Israel, to the Jewish people, because they had a covenant with God, what we call the Old Testament. So that's why Paul says to the Jew first, because they were first in line. And to the Greek also means to the Gentiles as well. So the gospel is a message that's not exclusive. It's intended for everyone. It's universal, by the way. Now, he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. What he means by that is not that he had any inclination to be embarrassed about the gospel. It doesn't mean that at all. That's not what his intent is. What he's saying is, I'm committed to this message. Nobody's going to get me to back off of this message, because Paul received lots of persecution for this message that he calls the gospel. A lot of people in his day, and I should add in this day as well, lots of people don't like the message of the gospel, because the message of the gospel goes contrary to a lot of people's assumptions, religious assumptions. Because the message of the gospel is not a message about you, about what you need to do. It's not a message about moral reform. It's not a message about you need to straighten up and fly right. It's not a message about you at all. It's a message about Christ and what He's already done. And that rubs some people the wrong way, I'm sorry to say. And Paul is here saying, I don't care what anybody thinks. I'm paraphrasing. I don't care what anybody thinks. I'm going to continue with this message. I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. Now, the reason the gospel, I told you it means good news. The reason the word gospel, good news, the reason it's good news is because it is, as he says here in verse 16, the gospel of Christ. That is to say, it is good news about Christ. It is a message not about you, but about Christ. You see, not everything that a religious person says is necessarily the gospel. Not everything that a preacher says is the gospel. For instance, if I stood up here today, there's a lot of things I could say that wouldn't be the gospel. If it's not good news, it's not the gospel. If I were to stand up here today and talk to you about your life and what's wrong in your life and cause you to become self-conscious and cause you to become insecure or uncertain in your relationship with God, I would not be preaching the gospel, because the gospel is not about you, it's the gospel of Christ. And second of all, I'd be a hypocrite to do that. First of all, it's the wrong message. Second of all, there's no reason for a preacher to stand up in front of people and tell them they need to change. The preacher's just as guilty as everybody else. We need to understand that there's no difference between the preacher and the people sitting there being preached to. Everybody's all in the same boat. As far as I'm concerned, Paul says there's none righteous, no, not one. That means the preacher is not righteous. The people he's preaching to are not righteous. There's only one that's righteous, and his name is Jesus. The preacher is not holy. The people he's preaching to are not holy. There's only one that's holy, and that's Jesus. There's only one that measures up to God's requirements, and that's Jesus. Everyone else falls short. That's why we all come and relate to God based on our faith in Christ, the one who already measures up, the one who's already holy, the one who's already righteous. We place our faith in Him, and our relationship with God is mediated by this perfect, righteous, holy Savior, who, by the way, is a Savior, and His business is saving. And I should add, He knows what He's doing. He knows how to do it. So He brings us into right relationship with God. Paul here says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, this message of good news about Christ. Listen to this, for it, that means this message about Christ and what He's done. For it is the power of God unto salvation. Paul says that this message is the power of God. It is the power of God. Now, there's a lot of things he could have put in there. There's a lot of things that some people assume and think brings about or draws on or creates the power of God. But it's not any of those things. He says if you want to know what the power of God is, if you want to know what connects you to the power of God, if you want to know what brings you in contact with the power of God in your life, it's the gospel. It's the message of Jesus and what He's done and what He continues to do and what He's all about. It's about Him and what His work is, not you and your work, but it is a message. And, by the way, he says, this message is the power of God unto salvation. That means resulting in, or leading to, or creating, or bringing about salvation, unto salvation. Now, when we read that word salvation, many times we think of it in a very narrow kind of definition, meaning that means I get to go to heaven when I die. And that's part of it. Don't want to take that away. Paul says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. So there is that. But guess what? We're not there yet. All of you listening to me, you're alive, I'm alive, we're here living in this world, dealing with all the situations and things in this world. The gospel is not just a message that has some relevance at the point where you're ready to die and go to heaven. It has relevance and meaning, and it manifests and brings about the power of God, brings it to you right now in this present tense. So let me say that the word salvation is a broad word. It means God's deliverance. It means God's intervention. It means God's manifest power in your life in the here and now, not just at the point when you're ready to die and go to heaven. It is that, and I'm not taking that away, but I'm saying it's broader than that. It includes and encompasses everything that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. It means God's deliverance or God's presence, God's intervention. It brings us into a right relationship with God where He is present in our everyday lives. The word salvation, it's like a big umbrella that's placed over you and your life. And it means a situation in which God is working and intervening and coming into focus in your life to do what needs to be done. And I might add, in this current situation that we're in, with the health situation, the coronavirus, and all of that, I know people. I sense people getting more and more afraid and concerned and anxious. This word salvation is God's intervention and delivering power over that as well. You know, God is bigger than coronavirus. And don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do what all the experts say you should do. Please do all those things, wash your hands and avoid crowds, and whatever it is they say to do, you should do all those things. But here's what I'm saying. You can do all those things and still be terrified. You can wash your hands and avoid big crowds, and you can be full of fear and anxiety and worry. Here's what I want to say to you, that God's power is present in your life and it's something that you can place your faith in the here and now, and He's bigger than anything that you face. He can bring us through everything. He can preserve us through anything. When Paul here says the gospel is the power of God unto salvation, he's saying that this message brings you in contact with the manifest power of God, and it is what you need it to be in the present tense. It is deliverance, it is His intervention in your life, it is His protection and preservation. All of those things are covered in this word salvation. Sometimes, let me try to say it to you this way. Sometimes I like to use the illustration of the ocean and an ocean liner. Let's just say you're out in the middle of the ocean, like on the Titanic, for instance, and the ship has gone down, and now you're in a terrible situation. You're out floundering in the water. You're in a hopeless situation, as a matter of fact, a fearful situation. But here comes a rescue ship and throws you the life preserver, and you take a hold of the life preserver, and you're brought on board the ship, and now you're safe. That's salvation. You are brought into a environment, into a context, into a situation where everything you were afraid of before no longer has any relevance, because now you've been saved, you've been rescued, you've been brought into a new situation. You're on board the rescue ship, and the captain has rescued you, and he has committed himself to make sure that you get to your destination. And so you don't need to be afraid and worried about any of the things that you were afraid and worried about when you were out there floundering in the water on your own. You see, that's what salvation means. It's an all-encompassing relationship with God, where you've been brought on board the rescue ship, so to speak. And He's rescued you, and He's committed to you. You know, here's the way Paul says it a little later on in this letter to the Romans, writing in chapter 8, when he's summing up all of his message of the gospel. He says, what shall we say to these things? He says, if God be for us, one translation says, what can be successful against us? And then he states this to sort of prove his point. He said, He that spared not His own Son, but delivered Him up for us all, how shall He not with Him freely give us all things? You know what that means? That means that if He sent Jesus to the cross to die for you, and now we're getting to this message of the gospel, what it really is, to die for your sins and to remove them as a factor forever, you have been brought into this relationship with God based on what He did. He says, you know, if He did the big thing, if He sent Jesus to die for you, how do you think He won't take care of all the lesser things as well? That's what's included in this word salvation. You've been brought onto the rescue ship. You have been delivered. Now you're under the care and the concern and the interest of the captain of the ship. He's rescued you, He's saved you, and He can preserve you. He's pulled you out of your life-threatening situation, and you can count on Him. Now, you've got a part to play in this. Let me get to that now. Paul said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God, resulting in salvation to everyone that believes. You see, what's your part in this? It's very simple, and it's actually very small, but it's important. Your part is to believe. Now, what does it mean to believe? Well, some people think, in things in a very narrow sense. Sometimes we think believe just means to mentally agree that certain propositions are true, and that's part of it. We do agree that certain propositions are true, but it's more than that. It means a reliance. It means a trust. What one Greek scholar said, J.B. Phillips, who translated the Bible into everyday language, he said, to believe in the biblical sense means that you transfer your confidence from yourself to Christ. Now let's go back to my story. Let's go back to my analogy about the person that fell off the Titanic and they're floundering out there in the water. You see, when you're out there in the water all by yourself and you're treading water and you're splashing around and you're desperately trying to keep your head above water, you're basically on your own. You're trying to stay afloat by your own strength. Now it's a hopeless situation. Your strength is not enough. Your strength is not going to last forever. But nevertheless, you are out there on your own, relying on your abilities and your own strength and your ability to tread water or to swim or to keep yourself afloat. That's you. That's your work. That's what you're trying to do. But here comes the rescue ship and throws to you the life preserver. So now you have a choice. You can either continue to try to do it on your own, or you can now put your trust in the life preserver by taking hold of it. You see, you can't afford to just sit there and ignore it. You have to take hold of it. That's what it means to believe. Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God, resulting in salvation to everyone that takes hold of the life preserver. That's what it means to believe. You see, when you're a Christian, the reason you're a Christian is just one thing. You have chosen to put your faith in Jesus. You have chosen to transfer your faith from yourself to Christ, where God is concerned. You have chosen not to stay out there floundering in the water, trying to do it your way and hoping I can make it, hoping I can swim enough to make it to shore, hoping I can do enough good swimming. That's how some people think of it. I hope I've done enough good things so that I can make it in. All of that floundering around out there in the water, hoping you can do enough good things, that's never going to cut it. What it means to trust or to believe, it means you take hold of the life preserver. And now you've got a hold of the life preserver, and the life preserver is your salvation. Now that you're a Christian, you've taken hold of Christ, and He is your salvation. And He pulls you on board the rescue ship, and now you're saved, now you're safe, now you're brought into a new environment of safety, and what you did has nothing to do with it. How good a swimmer you are is irrelevant now, because you've been brought into a safe situation just because of one single thing. That is, you placed your faith in the Savior. And now you're in a safe environment. You're on the rescue ship. And the captain who rescued you, he's not going to let anything happen to you. You just need to, you see, as Christians, what do we do in our ongoing Christian life? We just need to keep trusting. We just need to keep walking with Him by faith. He'll walk with you through everything that you face in your life. Jesus never did say that if you become a Christian, you'll never have any more problems. But here's what He did say. He said, in the world, you will have tribulation. That means trouble. That means problems. That means pressure. But He says, be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world. He prefaced that by saying, I've said these things to you that in me you'll have peace. He wants you to have peace of mind. Why? Because you understand that He is bigger than anything that you confront in the world. He said, I've spoken these things unto you that in me, because of your relationship with me, through that relationship with me, you can have peace. I want you to have peace, He says. And then He says, in the world, there's going to be trouble, there's going to be tribulation, there's going to be problems. And I think if He were addressing our current situation with the virus and all of the life-threatening things that are going on, He would say, yes, this is just one of those issues in the world that I was talking about back there in John chapter 16. He said, in the world, you'll have trouble. You'll have problems, but be of good cheer. In other words, don't be brought down by it. Don't be afraid. Don't be worried. Don't be concerned. Cheer up. Because why? Because I have overcome the world. That means Jesus is bigger than anything that's in the world. He's bigger than anything you face. He's bigger than any coronavirus. He's got more power than anything out here in the world. So he wants you to have peace of mind. Consider that analogy I just used a while ago about the rescue ship. He's saved you. He's pulled you on board the rescue ship. All you did was trust in him. All you did was quit trying to tread water on your own, but take a hold of the life preserver. You did that by believing in Jesus. Take hold of Jesus, and he pulls you on board the ship, and now you're safe. And he'll look after you. Now, what do we do in our lives, in our everyday life? Well, we just continue by that same rule. We just continue. But here's what Paul said, writing to the Colossians. You see, I thank God for the Apostle Paul because he had a supernatural encounter with Jesus, and Jesus explained it to him explicitly and told him to go tell it to everybody else. I think Paul never imagined that we, 2,000 years after the fact, would be reading what he wrote down. But I do think Jesus had that in mind, and I think he chose Paul exactly for that reason, knowing that Paul would write letters to the churches and they would be copied and transmitted down to every generation, because Paul gives us a very clear view of how the situation is. And here's what he wrote to the Colossians. He said, "As you have received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him." That means the same way that you start out, just continue. How do you start out? By faith, and that's alone. By trust, and that all by itself. By trusting in Jesus. So how do you continue? Same way, by faith, by trusting in Jesus. I've quoted this before, but I don't think it hurts to say it again. I think it's enlightening what Paul wrote to the Galatians. In Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, the second half of the verse says, "The life that I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." You see, Paul faced problems. He didn't have to face the coronavirus, but he had some other problems. He was shipwrecked more than once. That's kind of dangerous, just like my analogy. He literally had that experience, floundering out there in the water. He was shipwrecked. He was stoned and left for dead. He was whipped. He was imprisoned. He was betrayed. He had everything you can imagine just about happen to him. And it's very interesting when he tells that story. In fact, I think I'll read that right now. This is in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 where he tells this. And let me just give you the background before I read. In chapter 11, he tells the Corinthians about all the different things that he faced. Well, let me read it to you in case you want to know all the problems. He didn't have the coronavirus to worry about, but how about all of this? This is chapter 11 of 2 Corinthians, verse 24. "Of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one." That means to be whipped. "Thrice," that means 3 times, "I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I've been in the deep. In journeyings often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of mine own countrymen, in perils of the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness, in painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, and fastings often, and cold and nakedness." It sounds like when I read this list, you'd think to yourself, what else could there be? What else could you add to this? Well, think about our current situation. We've got to stay indoors and avoid having personal contact. And, to hear some people talk, you'd think it's the end of the world. All we've got to do is stay home and watch Netflix. Paul was shipwrecked and beaten up and whipped and, all of these painful physical experiences. But see, the reason I read all that to you is he learned something through that. Something that is very pertinent to what we're talking about today. You see, in the next chapter, he says, he came to believe or came to understand, came to know, to realize that all of this that he was suffering, it wasn't just by coincidence. He said, there is a demonic force behind it. And he said it's because of the abundance of the revelations which he received. He received abundant revelation from Jesus. I just told you Jesus gave him all of this so that he would transmit it to us. And he says, because of the abundance of these revelations, he said, a messenger of Satan came to me to buffet me. He says, and let's just call it a demonic attack. All of this stuff that happened to him, all of the beatings and the shipwrecks and He says that was all inspired by the devil. A demonic force was stirring up all of this trouble. And so he did the logical thing. He says in verse, I'm going to read in just a moment, but he said in chapter 12, he said, when I realized this, I prayed about it 3 different times on 3 occasions. And he says, I prayed and asked the Lord that it might depart from me. In other words, he asked for deliverance from this. But listen to this. I think this is really enlightening. We can learn something from Paul. In his problems weren't identical to ours, but in his difficulty, he prayed about it. He got this answer. I'm going to start with verse 8. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 12, starting with verse 8. He says, for this thing I besought the Lord thrice, meaning 3 times, that it might depart from me. See, he did the logical thing. We'd all do the same thing. I pray that you'd make it go away. You see, whenever we're in a difficult situation, that's our first impulse. Make it go away, you know. Well, maybe that's our first impulse, but you know, Jesus has already said, in the world, you're going to have trouble. But you know what? Here's the beautiful thing. Even though we face trouble in the world, he's right there with us. Why is he with us? To bring us through it, to deliver us. Just like that word salvation. It means deliverance. It means God's protection. It means he's here with us to see to it that we experience the deliverance that he promised to us. You know, he might not make everything go away, but he's here with us to bring us deliverance. Again, I'm reminded, and I'm going to read this here in just a moment. I'm also reminded of the story in the Old Testament about the 3, we call them the Hebrew children, actually young men. And they refused to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's idol, and it made Nebuchadnezzar really mad. And he says, heat up the furnace 7 times hotter than it's usually heated up. So he heated up his fiery furnace. And they took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they bound them. And Nebuchadnezzar had them thrown into the fiery furnace. Now you might say, that's a bad situation. And I might agree with you. That is a bad situation. Now, we'd like it better if God would, you know, wave a magic wand and say abracadabra and everything unpleasant will just disappear. But that's not what happened. In that story, Nebuchadnezzar threw them into a fiery furnace. But guess what? They were not burned. Nebuchadnezzar looked in the fiery furnace and he said, didn't I throw 3 men in there? And it says all of his counselors said, yes, Lord, you said 3. You know, he just got through throwing some guys in the fire, and so he asked a question. Sure, everybody's going to say yes. They're all very agreeable, I'm sure. So he said, didn't I throw 3 men in there? He said, yes, that's right, you threw in 3. He says, but look, I see 4 men, and the 4th looks like the Son of God. Now that's really what it said. That's really what Nebuchadnezzar said. And the only thing that got burned was the ropes that bound them. Their bonds were burned away, but they were not harmed. You see, what I'm saying is that God may not wave a magic wand and make all your trouble go away. In this current situation with the coronavirus, he's not going to wave a magic wand and make it go away. But guess what? Just like he was with them in the fiery furnace, he's with you. He's with me. Why is he with us? To bring us salvation, to bring us the deliverance that he promised. He's there to guarantee, he's here with us to guarantee that we experience what he promised that we would have. What's our part? Our part's to trust him. Our part's to believe. As Paul said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation, deliverance, for everyone that believes. That's important. You need to do that. You need to trust him in our present situation. Now, here I've got to the Apostle Paul. He prayed that it would all go away. He said, I prayed about this thing 3 times. And listen to the answer he got from Jesus. This is in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. But he, that is Jesus, he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Now, my paraphrase of that is like this. My grace is enough for you, and my strength is made perfect in your weakness. When you feel weak, when you feel powerless, that's okay, because that's when you can fully trust in his strength. You know, he said to him, you know, what is his grace, by the way? Grace is unmerited favor. What he said to Paul is, and to us, my favor in your life is enough. My grace, the gift of his unmerited favor, is enough. His strength, His power is perfected when we feel weak, in a situation where we feel like it's out of our control. You know, in the present situation, there's nothing really we can do about it. That's what makes some people feel anxious and afraid, because it's out of our control. There's nothing we can do to change the situation. But Jesus would say the same thing to us, I believe, that He said to the Apostle Paul. My grace, my unmerited favor is enough for you. My strength. And don't discount that. When He says His strength, He means real power, real strength, real force to bring about deliverance and safety. He's able to do that. He said it's perfected when you're weak. What Paul said next is, most gladly therefore will I glory or take pride in my infirmities, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. And he goes even further. Now, I don't know if we can go this far with Paul, but listen to this. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, persecutions, and distresses, for Christ's sake. But what he says next is very pertinent. For when I am weak, then I am strong. You see, he realized that the gospel is about Jesus and what He does. And when I find myself in a situation where I can't do anything, that's when I can fully trust in Him, because that's what it's all about anyway. It's all about Him and His work, and our part is simply to believe, to trust, to rely, to transfer all of our faith and our confidence to Him, and then He does all the rest. And I would say that in this current situation that we find ourselves in with the virus and the COVID-19 and the coronavirus and all the quarantining and all of that, here's what I want to suggest to you. That even though we can't do anything to influence the big picture, what he would say is, my unmerited favor is enough for you. If we'll simply place our trust in Him, place our reliance and our confidence and our trust in Him, He's able to bring about the deliverance and the safety and the security that is His job to produce. He's the one with the power. We're the ones that do the trusting. And we can rely on Him to see us safely through this current crisis. Thank you for listening today. And come back next week and we'll have something to talk about for Easter.